Hello, my name is Teixeira Melo, and I'm a researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra, Portugal. The title of my presentation is From Love Force and Families as a Complex System Towards an Integrative Approach to the Complexity of Love. So what I'm going to propose is I'm going to briefly present to you a new model of comprehension of the family as a complex system, where a fundamental transformational force was identified that we named as love force, that was translated as an emergent relational property that had significant impact over the individuals, particularly in moments of difficulty, or that became more evident in moments of difficulty and in dealing with challenges. From this conceptualization of love force as a sort of transformational and propelling emergent force from human relations, we could extrapolate and learn some lessons towards maybe a reconceptualization of love and an integration of a variety of perspectives that are currently available in the literature. So I'm going to just very briefly, and I won't have time to detail everything, I'm going to very briefly go through some basic concepts. So the model of the family as a complex system has emerged in the context of a research project that aimed to identify, to investigate change and resilience processes in multi-challenge families dealing with a variety of sources of adversity. And love force emerged as a critical emergent relational force, like a transformational power that was clearly coming out of the relationships that had effects over the individuals and allowed them to cope with adversity and to transform their own contributions to the family bonds and their own contributions to the family, as well as the whole interpersonal dynamics through its effects. The family as a complex system is informed by a complex systems approach, and I won't have time to detail, but I'd like to highlight that here in the end, the core of the model is focused on the coupling processes in the family. So relationships are conceptualized in different levels, from the individual to the level of the family network, to the level of the community network, and even broader networks, but with a focus on the particular processes that are implicated in the coupling process as a process and as an outcome, as a bond or as a pattern of influence. So the families are conceptualized, as I said, across these levels, and at each level, different types of coupling processes are identified that at the next level become an emergent pattern, and that also need to be coordinated and then give rise at different levels to new patterns. So we have here is a brief scheme that captures the coupling between these different coupling processes at different levels of organization of the family, from the individual contributions, and we have identified a number of properties that characterize the coupling at all these levels of organization, and I won't go through this, but the individuals make contributions toward their relationships with contributions that have to be coordinated then at the level of the reciprocal or the coordination dynamics between the individuals. Now, what the model assumes that these properties at some point give rise to emergent properties, things that were not there at the level of the individuals, but then once activated, and they're not always there, they're kind of like bubbles that lighten up and then dampen. When activated, they create a field of influence over the individuals and the dynamics of their coordination. So these emergent potentials, as we call them, can have really powerful effects over the individuals depending on their valence, on their nature, and on the context in which they are activated. So even though they generate a temporary experience that's associated with their activation, patterns might be established through time, and the effects might persist even though the coupling processes that give rise to them in the first place are no longer there. And this is pretty much what happens when these patterns are established that respond to bonds. So these properties, these emergent properties, to some extent characterize family bonds. So love force has appeared as a very special type of pattern of emergent properties. Now, I won't have time to detail them, but this is their description. So when these properties are predominantly positive, when the pattern is flexible and resilient, we say that a love force has been activated, and it can be expressed in these different potentials, and there's a certain number of dimensions of differentiation and integration of the bonds. So these emergent potentials can stay activated, but they will decay unless there is a reenactment or some processes awakening them to some extent. It is through these emergent potentials that bond between them interact, and these emergent fields somehow resonate with each other, and they might interact in either constructive or destructive ways, generating to some extent fields in families, but also in communities, and impacting then on the lower levels. So this is really a very brief explanation. But what I want to get to, and I'll come back to this, is to the status of development of the science of love and how this conceptualization of love force can eventually make a contribution. So love has been a focus of different domains of knowledge. The expression is prevalent in everyday discourse, and to some extent, there's a bit of a conceptual muddle that take a little bit of the heuristic power of the expression of love. The call for science of love has long been set forth, namely by Harold in his presidential APA speech. And there are many evidence of the suggestions of the importance of something that we might call love, that might be linking relatedness to well-being in human relationships. There has been the suggestion that love is a sort of supreme experience with benefits that clearly surpass those of common or more common or lower level positive emotions. But the science of love as a field has had some problems, namely problems with the definition of what love is. And a closer look will see a very fragmented field with unintegrated views, with definitely partial views. There are dispersed and insufficient efforts have been made to integrate and to relate, to understand how these different perspectives of love may relate to each other and may contribute to the understanding of something that happens at the level of human experience that can have a transformational impact on the individual. And to this extent, we relate this to our model of the family as a complex system. So the theory and research has somehow been scattered across different fields, even within a psychology of love. So a variety of studies have actually been conducted without a clear theoretical framework, without an explicit definition, and most models are descriptive. They explore components or correlates of love, but there's really very little explanatory frameworks for how love comes about, how can it be transformed, how does it develop, how does it change, and how does it change individuals. There's a clear predominance or more predominant approach, the reductionist approaches, that attempt to pin down love to particular relational properties and end up reducing them to it, reducing the love to these properties. And there's a great neglect for the dynamic dimension of the coordination between individuals that could be associated with an experience of love, and to the temporal dimension of love. With very few exceptions, most models of love do not address multiple levels of organizations of the human relationships where love can be identified. And it has actually mostly been investigated at an individual level and much less as a truly a relational property. So in many approaches, and in their lack of integration, or the lack of integration, failed to directly or fully address what we consider to be key questions, such as what is love? What is the nature of love? What is that thing that we call love? And as many papers have asked, and very few have fully addressed. Where is love? Where can we find it? When is love? When does love happen? How does it happen? How does it get transformed? And how does love operate, really? What are its effects? What are its mechanisms? So there have been many theories about different types of love with shared properties that are associated with with more than one prototype, hinting to the fact that there might be some core characteristics that unite different types of experiences of love. In practice, when we look at the science of love, the applications have been reduced in terms of interventions that are explicitly designed to target experiences of love or their transformation. There are a few exceptions in other domains, like contemplative practices and interventions that target love-related concepts, but they don't really affirm themselves as love interventions. But love in our studies has appeared truly, love force has appeared as a truly transformative effect, with a very significant impact on families dealing with processes of change, even, for example, in the context of child protection services or child protection cases. So, and in those cases, it was possible, in some cases of success, it was possible to activate what we call an experience of love force, and through those effects, mobilize action and mobilize change. So there's clearly a relevance in studying this phenomenon. There might be, like I said, contributions from this perspective of love force that can be brought into the science of love. There's clearly a lack of idiographic approaches of case-based and longitudinal studies. And the conceptions of love are very diverse. Love has been conceptualized as an emotion, as an affect or cognition, a motivational state, a type of bond, a relational narrative, a social construction, and there are different taxonomies, as I said. But clearly, each of these perspectives is insufficient in grasping the complexity of love. There is clearly some fuzziness. The multiple approaches signal that it might be a multidimensional phenomena. And there's clearly suggestions when we look at where can we find love, suggestions that it is truly an emergent property of a relational system, that it's other and different than the sum of the parts. And so it requires a model that can capture these dimensions as emergence, and complex systems approaches might be in a better position to allow us to understand this aspect of experiences of love and maybe even to integrate. So there's clearly indicators of the complexity of love understood from this complex system perspective. It can't be pinpointed, it can't be spatially located, it can't be captured by one model only. It clearly requires dynamic lenses for a full understanding, and it's not reducible to single properties. So there might be some blindness to the complexity of love, and there's clearly a need to find a framework that can connect these different perspectives that clearly point to something that's relevant, that's there, but it's insufficient per se. So this is where we believe that the model that we have developed of love force in the context of family relationships could be useful in providing a ground for a reconceptualization of love from a complex system perspective, where love appears as self-organized, where its properties are not reducible to the level of the individual, where it's clearly dependent on the interactions, but not truly determined by any particular property of these interactions, but emergent from their non-linear interaction, where it can be conceptualized as a force that once emerged constrains individual, dynamic, adaptive, and a force that is context dependent. So the centrality of the understanding of the interpersonal coupling is also important. So this framework allows us to respond to this question of what is love, saying that the response to this is necessarily dependent on the perspective of the observer, because there are multiple dimensions of love. But in general, love can be defined as an emergent relational force that's sustained in flexible, resilient, and predominant patterns of activation of emergent potentials or properties of in the interpersonal coupling processes or bonds when these processes become patterns through time. So the emergence or the activation of these potentials of the bonds are associated with experiences of love. And to some extent, love is a transient experience, as some models have suggested, that might decline unless they are reactivated. And it can be identified, not directly, we can't see love, we can't touch love, but we can feel their effects, or the effects of the activation of the emergent potentials that are associated with it. And I didn't have time to describe these potentials. They are available, and I'll be very happy to have more. They are available in some working papers as descriptions, and I would very happy to share more information. So the patterns of activations may stabilize, and to some extent then they might characterize love bonds. So we also know that the experiences and the meanings that are attributed then to those experiences are shaped and are constrained by social cultural factors. But the effects of these meanings might retain more or less these experiences, might allow for their preservation or even for the activation. And the effects of this experience will then have top-down effects influencing the individuals and the dynamics of their coordination. So love in this framework appears as a self-organized phenomenon. It just creates itself. But we can talk about an ecology of love in the sense that it has an expression or related processes in different levels of the ecology of the individual. So this would be a list of what we could call love emergent potential. So the positive patterns, the positive side of the emergent properties of the bonds that come out of that nonlinear interaction between the individual contributions and the dynamics and the specific properties of their coordination. I won't have time to detail them, but love from this perspective is seen as existing in a distributed way across an ecology, across a system, from the individual contributions to love, to the dynamics of their coordination, for the love in interactions, if we want to existing at the level of the bond or of the interaction in those emergent patterns of properties, of emergent properties of the coupling process, and which might become stabilize and then become love bonds. It exists to some extent in the wider fields that are generated in networks of love, such as the family, but also communities. So we might be talking about loving environments, and then we can talk a bunch about a series of processes that might constrain these lower levels, because we might have more or less love supporting communities, love supporting societies, or love supporting environments. So love can clearly be understood as a dynamical system, and I won't have time to detail, but the activation of those emergent properties is dependent on particular conditions. So we have fluctuations in the lower levels in the coupling interactions, and under certain conditions, they might lead to an activation or to a transformation of this emergent higher level properties. So the activation of love is a bit similar to a process of neural integration or neural summation. It might need a particular combination of properties, but there are clearly processes of multifinality and equifinality. The different configurations of properties could lead to the activation of love, and this is something that research should definitely look. So the realization of love comes through the activation of its potentials and its transformative effects on the level of the individuals. And please notice that I'm talking here of love as the positive expression of those potentials, but they are continuous, and there's a whole variety of expressions and dynamics. So you can clearly have the opposite of experiences of love. The model that we have developed has clear implications for interventions, and for example, for the evaluation of the potential for change of a relational system through the potential for the activation of love. And this is something that we've been working with, for example, with families that are in the child protection system. But you can also see how this conceptualization of the family as a complex system, when we apply the love perspective to it, would also allow us to integrate and to find a place for the different models of love, for the narratives of love, for the social cultural discourses, for the meanings, for understanding loves as bonds, as patterns of coupling, for understanding the cognitive, the behavioral, the motivation, or the emotional correlates of love as associated with the activation of those experiences of the emergent potentials of the bond, or with its effects. And we can talk about that individual level of the individual contributions to the relationships that eventually might lead to the activation of a love pattern and a love experience. So I'm sorry for being so fast. I hope I have just left enough ideas of interest that we might want to continue a discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.